Welcome to the lecture, The History of Public Speaking. The formalized instruction of public speaking has a long and illustrious history. The origins of public speaking begin in Athens in the 5th century BCE. The reason that formalized teaching began in this area was because they had a democratic system of government, and that meant it was a participatory democracy. Everybody was responsible for participating in government. So, for example, if you found yourself in a dispute with a neighbor, perhaps over land or cattle, you would defend yourself in the court of public opinion. And so that meant an understanding of public speaking and argumentation was essential to the citizens of that time. At that time, sophists taught rhetoric. Sophist is a name for teacher. And rhetoric simply means all available means of persuasion. At that time, sophists would come live with their students and teach them the art and ways of public speaking, and they would be itinerant teachers. There are several important sophists throughout history. The first sophist that I want to introduce to you is a sophist by the name of Corax, and Corax is the first known teacher of speech. Another famous sophist is Protagoras, and Protagoras was the father of debate structure, argumentation, rebuttals, all the things that we still use today. The third sophist, Gorgias, focused on language and audience adaptation, another central point in formalized public speaking in the 21st century. Isocrates wrote the first speech handbook, at least the first speech handbook that we have found. Aristotle, which many of you are probably familiar with, wrote about artistic and inartistic proofs of argumentation. Artistic proofs would be things like credibility and character. Inartistic proofs would be things like argumentation, tropes, those types of things. The final sophist, Hippias, was a liberal arts educator, and he focused on teaching the all-around student. There are stories about Hippias that he was a very arrogant instructor, and that he wore robes of purple, he made his own jewelry, and he was fond of saying that he'd never met his better in anything. So what do these ancient sophists have to do with a Wartburg education? They're all connected to a liberal arts model of education. We can't have public speaking without having an idea of what's going on in the sciences and the humanities. And the sciences and the humanities and the social sciences can't exist without rhetoric. For example, if you come up with a cure for cancer, but you can't communicate that to anyone, then your cure for cancer becomes a moot issue. So public speaking is at the heart of a liberal arts education. Over the years, communication scholars have proposed models of communication to explain the way we interact as humans, and I'm going to introduce 3 of them to you in this lecture. The first model of communication is a linear model of communication. It presupposes there's a sender that sends a message through a channel to a receiver. Now that channel could be face-to-face communication, it could be a poster, it could be television, radio, newspaper, but the idea is it's one-way communication. A sender sends a message through a channel and the receiver receives it and decodes it. Now along the way there may be noise to distort that particular message, but the idea is that we could track a message from its origins to its recipient. Now there are some serious problems with this particular model of communication. It assumes that there's one-way communication. It also assumes that the receiver doesn't respond to the sender, and that it would be easy to isolate communication breakdowns on the linear model of communication. But we know that communication doesn't work that way. This particular model is based on television viewing, which makes sense since this model was created in the 1950s and 60s after the advent of television, and researchers were trying to find a way to explain the popularity of television and how it impacted mass audiences. But even when you're watching television, there is a response from the receiver. If there wasn't, shows that were on 40 years ago would still be deemed popular if there was no feedback. And so we know that there is feedback. And so the linear model of communication doesn't fully explain human communication as we know it today. It became clear to researchers that the linear model of communication was faulty, and so a second model has been proposed, the interactional model of communication, where a sender sends a message through a channel to a receiver, and then the receiver gives feedback to the sender. Again, like in the previous model, there could be noise to disrupt or distort the message. This particular model is more inclusive of the receiver and the receiver's decoding of the message and subsequent feedback to the sender. And so in that respect, it addresses some of the issues of the linear model of communication. However, if you think about face-to-face communication and the way that we communicate interpersonally, this model of communication doesn't really work. Imagine that you're talking to your friend and you give a message and you wait for them to receive it and send feedback. This model of communication assumes that there's nothing going on in between, or that communication between sender and receiver don't overlap. So therefore, this model leaves out the idea of nonverbals and those types of things. Think about when you're sitting in a classroom. If you are confused about what the professor is saying, perhaps you would give a nonverbal to that professor so that they might repeat what they said, or you might raise your hand to ask a question. So this model, while better than the linear model, still doesn't take into account that there might be simultaneous communication going on between the sender and the receiver at the same time. In light of the flaws with the linear model of communication, as well as the interactional model of communication, a third model has been proposed, the transactional model of communication. In this model, the sender is a simultaneous receiver. For example, if you are sitting in a classroom listening to a professor lecture, your nonverbals may be sending a simultaneous message to the sender. And so while you're a receiver, you can also be a sender at the same time. Another example, perhaps you are talking with your best friend. A lot of times when we're talking with people who are familiar with us, we talk over each other and we still understand what's going on in the communication process. So the transactional model of communication allows for simultaneous communication between several parties. It also allows for us to consider things like nonverbal communication. You still have a message coming through a channel, but if you see, there is an arrow on both ends of the line of communication, showing that simultaneous communication can happen. There can still be noise to disrupt or distort the information, and it's important to know that noise can come in two forms. It can be external noise, meaning something going on around you is disrupting the communication, maybe a loud noise, maybe the phone is crackling when you're talking to someone on the phone. But noise can also be internal noise as well, or listener or speaker generated. For example, maybe you're listening to a topic that tends to be a hot button issue for you. Well, you may not listen as well, or you may have immediate reactions to that message. The final element of the transactional model, which makes it different from both the linear and the interactional model, is that we consider context or situation. For example, you don't talk the same way to a 6-year-old that you would to a 60-year-old. Or perhaps your style of communication is different when you're talking to your mom versus when you're talking to your pastor. Or perhaps your style of communication is different when you're in a class that's a gen ed class versus a class where you are surrounded by peers who understand the same topic that you do. For example, maybe a higher level biology class. You can use terms that are familiar to those who are in your peer group. So the transactional model of communication gives a more holistic approach to how communication actually happens in real time in the real world. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture of the history of public speaking, the origins of public speaking, as well as the models of communication. Don't forget to take the online quiz that accompanies this lecture. You can find it on my.wartburg under coursework.